The CEO was sweating. Billionaires stared. No one could understand the foreign client. Just when the million-dollar deal was about to fall apart, a little girl walked in, the janitor's daughter, and what she did next left the entire boardroom speechless. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. The room was silent. All eyes were on the CEO, his hands trembling, sweat forming on his forehead. Across the polished boardroom table sat 5 billionaire investors from a foreign country, staring blankly. No one could understand them. And worse, no one could speak their language. A million-dollar deal was slipping away, second by second. Just minutes earlier, the atmosphere had been full of confidence. The CEO had entered the room with a firm handshake, a charming smile, and bold promises. "This is it," he had whispered to his vice president. "This deal will take us global." Everyone on the team believed it. They had prepped for weeks. The presentation was flawless. The numbers made sense. The offer was strong. Everything had gone according to plan until it came time for the Q&A. That's when things started unraveling. The translator, an essential piece of the puzzle, never showed up. A last-minute text message had come through, something vague, about a family emergency. But by then, it was already too late. No one else in the company spoke the investor's language. The CEO tried to improvise, tossing out words in English and gesturing wildly, hoping body language would bridge the gap. It didn't. The investors remained quiet, their expressions unreadable, their hands folded in their laps like statues. Minutes dragged like hours. The pressure was unbearable. Executives exchanged glances. Some whispered nervously. Others looked down, unable to meet their CEO's eyes. And then, the sound of a soft voice cut through the silence. "I can translate," she said. Heads turned. At first, no one recognized her. She stood quietly near the back of the room, holding a broom. Her hair was tied back, and her janitor's uniform looked completely out of place among the tailored suits and designer watches. But there was something in her tone, calm, confident, certain, that stopped everyone. It was the janitor's daughter. Maya. She'd come to help her father clean after school, as she often did. While she usually stayed out of sight, she had a habit of listening quietly from the hallway. She was 17, shy, and practically invisible to most of the company's high-powered employees. Until now, the CEO blinked in disbelief. "You speak their language?" Maya nodded. "Fluently. I studied it in school, and I've been watching your presentations for weeks." She stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. "I know what this deal means." For a moment, no one moved. Then the CEO, with nothing left to lose, stepped aside. She walked to the head of the table and bowed slightly, greeting the investors in their language. Their eyes lit up immediately. One of them leaned forward, responding with interest. Another smiled for the first time that morning. Maya translated smoothly, switching back and forth between both parties with ease and grace. Her words were precise, her tone respectful, her timing perfect. The room transformed. The silence was replaced with conversation, the tension with laughter. The CEO regained his footing, pitching the company's vision while Maya stood beside him, bringing his message to life. The investors asked questions, tough ones, and she translated them flawlessly. What had been a disaster just 10 minutes earlier was now a success unfolding in real time. When the meeting ended, the investors rose to their feet and shook hands. Not just with the CEO, but with Maya. One of them even handed her a business card and bowed politely. The CEO looked at her, still stunned. "Where did you learn to do that?" "My mom's from their country," she said simply. "And I love languages. I've been translating TED Talks for fun." The entire room burst into soft, relieved laughter. The deal was not only back on the table, it was signed that same day. Later that evening, after the investors had left and the office was buzzing with excitement, the CEO asked Maya and her father to join him in his office. Her dad looked nervous, unsure if they were in trouble. But instead, the CEO turned to Maya and smiled. "How would you like a full scholarship and an internship starting next week?" Her father's eyes welled with pride. Maya nodded slowly, a mixture of shock and joy on her face. That night, she left the building not just as the janitor's daughter, but as the girl who saved the company. Because sometimes heroes don't wear suits. Sometimes they wear janitor uniforms and speak the language no one else can. Her name was Amara. just 9 years old. She had come to the office with her dad, the night janitor, because he couldn't find a babysitter. It wasn't the first time. On most nights, Amara would quietly sit in a back room doing her homework or reading from the small stack of books her dad always brought along to keep her busy. But tonight was different. While her father quietly mopped the marble hallway, Amara stood just outside the glass boardroom, her small fingers clutching a worn, dog-eared book, a language guide filled with hand-scribbled notes and flashcards she had made herself. She wasn't snooping. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop. She was just curious. Something about the way the suits were pacing and whispering caught her attention. She could sense the tension. The room, once so full of confident energy, now felt heavy, nervous, almost scared. Then she heard it, the foreign language. The one she'd been teaching herself in secret for almost a year. Her eyes lit up. Words and phrases swirled in her mind, matching what she heard through the glass. She flipped open her book, scanning her notes, checking her understanding. And then, without thinking twice, she walked in. "Excuse me," she said softly. The entire room froze. A 9-year-old girl in a pink hoodie and sneakers had just stepped into a boardroom filled with millionaires and executives in $1,000 suits. The CEO turned sharply, his face pale. "Amara," he hissed. "This isn't the time." But Amara didn't back down. She looked straight at the group of investors, the ones no one in the room could understand, and spoke again. This time, fluent in their language. Her tone was careful, her words clear. She wasn't just repeating phrases she'd memorized. She understood them. The investors' eyes widened. One of them leaned forward, clearly surprised. Another smiled and said something in response, a full sentence. Amara paused, thought for a second, then replied with the same confidence. Gasps filled the room. The CEO stared at her, stunned. He opened his mouth to speak, but said nothing. Amara walked slowly to the head of the table, her language guide still in hand. "You said you needed someone to translate," she said calmly. "I think I can help." The tension began to lift. One by one, the investors turned their full attention to the small girl, now acting as the bridge between two worlds. Amara translated with care, her young voice steady as she relayed the CEO's pitch and the investors' replies. At first, some of the executives exchanged skeptical looks. But the more she translated, the more it became clear she was the real deal. Questions were asked. Answers were given. The meeting, which had been on the verge of collapsing, was now alive again. Amara's translations were smooth and thoughtful. She even smiled shyly when one investor made a light joke, translating it with perfect timing, and getting a laugh out of the CEO, who hadn't smiled in 20 minutes. For the next half hour, she stood there, 9 years old, barely tall enough to reach the edge of the table, and conducted one of the most important conversations in her father's company's history. When it was all over, the investors stood, thanked her in their native language, and shook hands with the CEO. But before leaving, one of them turned to Amara and said something in a slower, more formal tone. She listened carefully, then translated it aloud for the room to hear. "He says, you have a gift, and that your father should be very proud." Her dad, who had been standing quietly in the hallway, watching in stunned silence, had tears in his eyes. He rushed in and hugged her tightly, whispering, "I am proud. More than you'll ever know." The CEO bent down and looked Amara in the eyes. "How did you learn all that?" he asked, still visibly shaken. Amara smiled. "YouTube and books, and I kind of fell in love with the language." Everyone in the room laughed, this time with real relief and admiration. That night, a multi-million-dollar deal was saved by a little girl in sneakers and a hoodie. Not a translator, not an executive, not a business school graduate, just Amara, the janitor's daughter, who loved languages and believed that even the smallest voice can make the biggest difference. And from that day forward, she was no longer just the quiet kid waiting in the hallway. She was the reason the company went global. What nobody knew was that Amara had a secret to everyone else. She was just the janitor's daughter, a quiet, curious 9-year-old who sometimes tagged along with her father during his night shifts. She didn't talk much. She didn't cause trouble. Most employees barely noticed her sitting in the break room with a backpack full of snacks, crayons, and old chapter books. But Amara wasn't just passing time. For the past 2 years, while her father vacuumed hallways and emptied trash bins long after the building closed, Amara had been studying. Every night, she brought with her a stack of borrowed books from the local library. She read everything, from fairy tales to science magazines. But what fascinated her most were languages. She had discovered a language learning app on a donated tablet her school gave her. From there, she was hooked. She would borrow language guides, watch videos with subtitles, and scribble down words in a notebook she protected like treasure. While other kids were playing games, Amara was learning how to greet someone in 5 languages. But her favorite language, the one spoken by the very billionaires sitting in that boardroom. She didn't even know why at first. Something about the rhythm, the structure, the challenge. It was difficult, and that made her love it more. Over time, she began to understand not just the grammar, but the culture behind it. The way they greeted with subtle bows, how they valued indirect speech, how tone carried more weight than words. She practiced every night, whispering phrases into the mirror, pretending to be an ambassador, a tour guide, a translator. Her dad would peek in on her sometimes and smile, not fully grasping what she was doing, but proud all the same. When Amara stood outside the glass boardroom that night, clutching her dog-eared language guide, watching the CEO stumble through a failing deal. She knew. She knew this moment had been waiting for her all along. When she heard the foreign language being spoken, awkwardly, haltingly, and saw the confusion clouding the investors' faces, she couldn't stay silent. She opened the door, stepped into the silence. "Excuse me," she said. That it was like dropping a pebble into a still pond. Heads turned, eyes narrowed. A child? In a room full of powerful men in suits. The CEO turned red. "Amara," he whispered urgently. "Not now." But she didn't leave. She took a breath, looked directly at the investors, and greeted them in their language. Not shyly, not awkwardly, but with the calm, clear voice of someone who had said those words 1,000 times. The transformation was instant. One of the investors raised his eyebrows. Another leaned forward, intrigued. They replied, cautiously at first, testing her fluency. But Amara didn't miss a beat. She responded naturally, her eyes bright, her tone precise. Everyone in the room was stunned. She walked to the head of the table, opened her little notebook, and turned to the CEO. "You were saying something about the global expansion strategy?" she asked, like she belonged there. And then she began to translate, not just word for word, but with confidence, with clarity, with cultural nuance. She softened the CEO's blunt tone. She added the politeness levels the investors were used to. She even adjusted humor when needed, earning a chuckle from one of the more reserved guests. She had the instincts of a trained interpreter, but she was only 9. The CEO could barely believe it. Just moments ago, the deal had been dying. Now, the conversation was flowing, smoothly, respectfully, meaningfully. Executives who had been frozen in anxiety just minutes before were now engaged and hopeful again. By the end of the meeting, the lead investor smiled, shook the CEO's hand, and turned to Amara. He said something softly in his native language. She listened and translated it for the room. "He says he's never seen a translator so young or so skilled. And he believes you're destined for something great." Amara blushed, glancing at her father in the hallway. His eyes were glassy with pride. After the investors left and the room began to buzz with excitement again, the CEO knelt beside Amara. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked, still stunned. She shrugged. "Since I was 7, I think. I just really love languages." And from that day on, the entire company knew Amara wasn't just the janitor's daughter. She was the quiet genius who saved the biggest deal in company history, and the girl who proved that preparation, passion, and courage don't come with age. The room transformed. Tension melted into amazement. Worry gave way to wonder. The once silent boardroom, heavy with stress and confusion, now buzzed with energy. Where there had been frowns, there were now raised eyebrows and half-smiles. Executives leaned forward. The CEO, who had moments ago been frozen with fear, now stood a little taller. Though he still looked at the young girl beside him as if she were a walking miracle, Amara, just 9 years old, stood at the head of the polished boardroom table. A pink hoodie and scuffed sneakers didn't match the setting, but no one cared anymore. She was speaking fluently, confidently, in the language of billionaires, calmly navigating a high-stakes meeting like she'd done it 100 times. She didn't just translate. She listened. when one of the investors used a complex phrase about market positioning. Amara paused for a second, then turned to the CEO and explained it in terms he could understand. She didn't just carry words across a language barrier. She carried meaning, tone, nuance, and intent. She softened a sharp question. She reframed an awkward sentence. She even asked a question of her own at one point, on behalf of the CEO, using a phrase the investors instantly recognized as culturally respectful. The investors took notice. They began to smile more. Their body language shifted. The stiff postures relaxed. One of them even chuckled when Amara translated a company slogan into a clever play on words in their language. The momentum shifted. The meeting that had started as a slow collapse became a lively discussion. At one point, the CEO turned to his team and whispered, "She's saving us." By the end of the conversation, the investors stood up, clapping, not out of politeness, but out of genuine admiration. One of the elder investors, a man known for being notoriously hard to impress, looked at Amara and said in his native tongue, "She has more wisdom than most adults we deal with." Amara translated it aloud, her voice steady, though a faint smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. The CEO looked at her with wide eyes, as if seeing her for the first time. A moment ago, she was just a child in the wrong room. Now, she was standing beside him, not just as a helper, but as a hero. And then, something incredible happened. One of the investors reached into his briefcase, pulled out a pen, and signed the deal, right there, on the table. One by one, the others followed. No delays. No, we'll think about it. No rescheduling. Just bold signatures, right across the dotted line. The CEO's hands were still trembling, not from fear, but from sheer disbelief. When it was his turn to sign, he glanced at Amara beside him. She nodded once, as if to say, "You've got this." He smiled, exhaled, and placed his signature on the final page. The deal was closed. The billion-dollar deal the company had spent months preparing for. The one everyone thought had slipped away. When the translator failed to show, was saved by a girl who had quietly taught herself a language in the back of a janitor's closet. After the investors left, the room exploded with emotion. Laughter, clapping, high fives. No one could stop talking about what had just happened. The CEO turned to Amara, kneeling to her height. I don't even have the words," he said, voice thick with emotion. "How did you learn all that?" She shrugged. "Books, videos. I listened. I practiced when my dad was working. I like learning how people talk." The CEO glanced over at Amara's father, who stood near the doorway, wiping tears from his eyes. "We were about to lose everything," the CEO said. "And then you walked in. Like it was nothing." "It wasn't nothing to me," Amara replied softly. "I've been dreaming of speaking like that for a long time." He smiled, then stood and faced his team. "Starting tomorrow," he announced, "Amara gets access to any resource she wants. Tutors, technology, mentorship, whatever she needs, she's earned it." Her father clutched her hand tightly, unable to speak. That night, Amara didn't just walk out of the office as the janitor's daughter. She walked out as the girl who had saved a company, closed a billion-dollar deal, and reminded a room full of executives that true brilliance can come from the most unexpected places. When it was all over, Amara didn't brag. She didn't boast. She didn't even seem to understand just how extraordinary her actions had been. As the final handshake was made, as the room filled with quiet disbelief and murmurs of admiration, Amara simply closed her worn notebook, smiled politely, and turned around. And then she ran, right out of the boardroom, past the gleaming floors and glass walls, into the hallway, where her father still stood frozen, mop in hand, tears shining in his eyes. She wrapped her arms around him tightly. "I did it, Daddy," she whispered. He dropped the mop and held her like he'd never let go. In that moment, the noise of the boardroom behind them faded. But not for long, because something incredible happened next. The same men and women who moments ago sat in stunned silence, millionaires, board members, international investors, stood up and applauded. Not just for the deal. Not just because the company had been saved, but for her, for the little girl in a hoodie who had stepped in when no one else could. For the child whose brilliance outshone every suit in the room. The CEO stepped into the hallway, still visibly emotional. He looked at Amara and her father, a humble man who had cleaned those very halls for years, and said, "We owe you everything." He knelt beside Amara, meeting her wide eyes. "You don't just understand language," he said. "You understand people. That's rare. That's leadership." Then, without hesitation, he pulled a document from his folder, blank but official looking, and spoke loud enough for everyone in the corridor to hear. "Amara, from this day forward, you have a full scholarship. Whatever school you want, any program, any dream, we'll cover it. Not just because you deserve it, but because we believe in you." Gasps filled the hallway. Amara looked up at her father. His hands trembled. He nodded through tears. "Say thank you, Mija," he whispered, voice cracking. "Thank you," she said, in perfect English, and then, for good measure, in the language of the investors, who smiled proudly from behind the glass. The moment was surreal. A child who had once sat quietly in break rooms while her father worked nights was now being treated as a hero. Not out of charity, not for sympathy, but because of her ability, her courage, her brilliance. That night, as the building emptied, the janitor walked out not in silence, but surrounded by handshakes, back pats, and whispered praise. He walked out with his head held high. And beside him walked Amara, not just as his daughter, not just as a student of language, but as the girl who saved the company when no one else could on their way home. Amara looked up at the stars. "Do you think I'll be a real translator someday?" she asked. Her father chuckled, holding her hand. "Mija, you already are." And as they disappeared down the sidewalk, a father and daughter, one carrying a mop and the other a book, they left behind more than a clean floor and a signed deal. They left behind a lesson, that a reminder that brilliance doesn't always wear a suit. Sometimes it carries a secondhand backpack, clutches a library book with folded corners, and walks beside a janitor late at night. Never underestimate someone because of where they come from, because talent isn't about titles. It's about heart and courage and the willingness to step forward when everyone else stays silent. And in a world full of closed doors, that night, Amara kicked one wide open for herself, for her father, and for every child who dares to dream beyond their circumstance. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories that prove greatness can come from anywhere. This is your channel name, where every voice matters and every story has the power to change hearts. See you in the next one.